Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
At my brother's engagement party, the lights were warm, the wine was flowing, and the dining room was full of familiar faces, all turned in the same direction. All looking at him. Daniel. My brother. The golden boy. The prodigal son. The one who never heard the word no unless it came from someone outside the family, and even then, my mother would find a way to smooth it over, twist the narrative, and make sure that he still came out of it not only unscathed, but somehow shining even brighter than before. I was sitting at the far end of the table, next to a cousin I barely remembered, picking at a dry piece of roast chicken that no one really cooked with love, and listening to my mom telling a story, yet again, about how Daniel got accepted into 3 Ivy League schools on the same day and how he just couldn't decide which full ride he should accept. That story? It's at least 15 years old, and somehow it gets longer, more dramatic, and more self-congratulatory every time she tells it. According to the current version, the dean of one of the universities called our house personally to beg Daniel to attend. That never happened. I was there. But truth doesn't matter when it comes to my mother and Daniel. What matters is the myth. And the myth is sacred. As I reached for the bottle of red wine that had made it halfway down the table, my mother turned to me mid-sentence, eyebrows raised in that way she does when she wants to remind me that even breathing too loudly can count as interrupting, and said, so casually it cut like a knife, "Let him shine, Carla. Just for once. Don't make this about you." I wasn't even speaking. I hadn't said a word all night. And that right there was the moment I knew, the moment I felt, that whatever storm had been quietly building for the past 3 decades was about to find a reason to blow through this carefully curated little event, with its charcuterie boards and its fake smiles and its tightly choreographed toasts. It wouldn't be me who threw the first punch, not literally, not metaphorically, but I had a feeling I wouldn't walk away untouched either. You know, I've sat through every single one of Daniel's milestones: high school graduation, college honors, his first job offer, his startup launch, his brief flirtation with TED Talks, and every single time, I've been told to stay in the background. Be supportive. Smile. Don't make waves. And every single time I did. I smiled. I clapped. I gave the toast. I took the damn pictures. Even when my own achievements got brushed off like lint on a black suit jacket. Even when, at my college graduation dinner, which I paid for, by the way, my mom insisted we leave early because Daniel had a big work thing in the morning. It was a Wednesday. And still, I said nothing. But that night, that party, that glittering moment that was supposed to crown him once again, the universe cracked just a little. It was Erica who did it. Daniel's fiancée. Tall and elegant in a pale blue dress that hugged her in a way that said, "I know what I'm doing," had been quiet most of the evening, letting Daniel bask in his spotlight like the obedient accessory everyone expected her to be. She laughed at the right jokes, nodded in the right places, and kissed his cheek exactly twice when someone gave a toast. But right after the dessert plates were cleared, just as someone was starting to uncork a bottle of champagne for what was clearly meant to be his final bow, Erica cleared her throat, stood up, her chair scraping a little too loudly against the polished floor, and said something that made the room collectively suck in its breath and hold it like a lungful of smoke. She said, "I found out something you should all hear." There it was. Not loud. Not hysterical. No drama in the delivery. Just those 10 words, spoken clearly, without shaking, and yet they hit like a slap across the face. The chatter died instantly. One cousin froze mid-pour. My aunt's fork hovered halfway between her plate and her mouth. My dad looked up from his phone, blinking as if the Wi-Fi had cut out. And my mom? She froze. Her wine glass, filled to the brim with overpriced Merlot, stopped just before her lips. Her expression didn't change, not at first. But her eyes moved. Slowly. Deliberately. And they landed directly on me. Not on Daniel. Not on Erica. Not on the phone that Erica now held in her right hand, as if she were about to read something from it. But on me. Me. As though I had orchestrated this moment from the shadows. As though I had planted the seed, whispered the secrets, pulled the string, and now was just sitting back to watch the bomb go off. The thing is, I hadn't done anything. But in that moment, with her sharp gaze cutting through me like a hot blade through butter, I realized something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. She thought I had. And worse than that? She thought I should be ashamed of it. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been accused of doing something you wished you had the guts to do? Not because you want revenge. Not because you want attention. But because for once in your goddamn life, you want the truth to matter more than the image? What would you do in that moment? Would you stay quiet again? Or would you finally stand up? Because I'm telling you, I didn't say a single word yet. I didn't make a scene. I didn't gasp or cry or leap to my feet. I just sat there, with my fork still in my hand, and looked back at my mother. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't look away. I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize with my eyes. I let her look. And I watched the certainty in her expression flicker, just for a moment. Because deep down, I think she knew, if this secret was finally coming out, then it wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the end of the cover-up. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the one who'd spilled it. But I damn well wasn't going to stop it either. There's a strange kind of silence that follows an explosion, not the immediate, ringing kind that people describe after a bomb goes off, but a slower, heavier, more suffocating silence that comes when something long buried has finally forced its way to the surface, demanding to be heard whether anyone wants to hear it or not. And that was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around me in the seconds after Erica's voice broke through the party's carefully choreographed noise. And yet, as I sat there watching my mother narrow her eyes at me with that deadly calm expression she'd perfected over decades, the one that always made it clear that nothing in this family happened without consequence, I found myself thinking not about what Erica might say next, or what Daniel would do when the spotlight turned harsh, or even what everyone else in the room would whisper about tomorrow, but instead about the fact that none of this, not a single damn second of it, had anything to do with me. And yet, somehow, I knew I was about to be dragged straight through the center of the fire anyway. Because here's the truth, I hadn't told Erica anything. Not directly, not explicitly, not in the kind of dramatic sit-down you'd see in some daytime talk show where secrets spill out like red wine on white carpet. I hadn't called her with evidence or pointed her toward anything. But I'd had the chance. I'd stood at the edge of that cliff not even 2 weeks earlier, and I'd looked down, and I'd thought hard about whether or not it was time someone finally pushed Daniel off the pedestal we'd all been forced to hold up for the last 30 years. And I hadn't done it. Not because I didn't want to. God, I wanted to. But because, like always, I froze. I doubted. I played it safe. It started with a folder. Nothing dramatic. Just a manila folder on my kitchen counter, the kind of thing you'd mistake for boring office paperwork or tax returns if you didn't know better. It was left there by accident, if we're being generous, or carelessly, if we're being honest. Daniel had stopped by my place unannounced, like he always did when he needed something, a signature, a reference, a place to vent where Mom wouldn't interrupt every 10 seconds to tell him how brilliant he was. I'd been chopping onions when he came in, talking on Bluetooth about some shady investment opportunity that wasn't technically illegal but required some discretion, and I hadn't thought much of it until he left. And I noticed he'd forgotten the folder he'd pulled from his bag earlier, filled with documents I assumed were related to his job. But curiosity has teeth, and when you've been raised to stay silent, sometimes the only rebellion you're brave enough to try is to look when you're not supposed to. Inside were emails, printed, not digital, because Daniel's old school like that when he's hiding something, and receipts, and photos that didn't make sense at first, but slowly began to form a picture I couldn't unsee. Multiple bank accounts. Large wire transfers to names I didn't recognize. Hotel receipts from cities he never mentioned visiting. And worse, messages to women who weren't Erica. Flirty, crude, sometimes explicit messages written in the kind of careless, arrogant tone Daniels always used when he thought the rules didn't apply to him. Some of them dated back to before the engagement. Some were as recent as last month. I sat at my kitchen table for almost an hour staring at that folder, my hands shaking, my stomach in knots, not because I was surprised, not really, but because part of me had always suspected, had always known. And now I had proof that the golden veneer my mother worked so hard to polish had rotted beneath the surface a long time ago. And still, I said nothing. I put the folder in a drawer. I poured myself a drink. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it would backfire, that Erica wouldn't believe me, or worse, that she would believe me and then forgive him anyway, and I'd be the villain for breaking the illusion. I knew how these things went. I'd seen it happen before. Women don't like the messenger when the message destroys their fairy tale. And my family? They'd never forgive me for humiliating Daniel. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't have predicted, was that a few days later, Erica would call me. Not Daniel. Not my mom. Me. And it wasn't to accuse or confront. It was something gentler, more cautious, like she was testing the air for cracks before she dared step forward. She said, "Hey, Carla, can I ask you something? Off the record." I said sure, pretending to sound casual even though my palms were sweating. "Has Daniel ever been different around you? I mean, growing up. Was there anything weird? Controlling?" It was such a strange question, so oddly specific and yet open-ended, that I felt my whole body tighten with recognition. She wasn't asking about cheating. She was asking about patterns. About power. And I froze again. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew the cost of saying it out loud. So I laughed light, deflective, and said something like, "He was always the golden boy. You know that. Charismatic. A little bossy. But hey, he's Daniel." I hated myself as soon as I hung up. Because I'd given her nothing when I should have given her everything. And now, sitting at this table, watching Erica hold her phone in her hand like it was a loaded gun, and watching my mother stare at me like I'd just taken out a hit on her favorite child, I realized something that made my throat close up with shame and fury, and something dangerously close to relief. It wasn't me who told her. But it should have been. Because if someone had to burn it all down, why shouldn't it have been the one who spent her entire life sweeping the ashes under the rug? And as my mother leaned in slightly, wine still untouched, eyes full of cold suspicion, and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear over the tension in the room, "What did you tell her?" I felt something shift inside me, not panic, not guilt, but a quiet, simmering defiance I hadn't felt since I was a teenager hiding report cards that weren't straight A's. I didn't answer. Because for the first time in a long time, I realized I didn't owe anyone a damn explanation. Especially not the woman who never once asked Daniel what he was hiding. It's strange how one quiet moment can rearrange the entire shape of your world, not through violence, not through yelling, not even through confrontation, but through the kind of slow, creeping unraveling that starts with a single question, softly spoken. Like a crack in the ice you barely notice until suddenly the whole surface beneath your feet gives way and swallows you whole. And that moment, that unraveling, began for me not at the party, not in the dining room with everyone staring and the air hanging so thick with anticipation it might as well have been fog, but a few days earlier. During an unremarkable afternoon when Erica's voice slid through my phone speaker like a quiet knock on a door I didn't know I'd locked from the inside. She had called me under the pretense of asking about flower arrangements, something she claimed to need a second opinion on, as if my opinion had ever held weight in this family. But even in those first few minutes, I could tell there was something else behind her words, something heavy she was carrying that she wasn't sure how to name yet. I'd been standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot of lentils I wasn't in the mood to eat, when her tone shifted slightly, moving from casual to tentative, and she said, almost too softly, "Can I ask you something a little personal?" That question, simple as it sounded, made my stomach clench the way it does when you're bracing for a memory you've worked very hard to bury. And before I could respond, before I could give her the out, I knew she was half expecting something like, "You don't have to," or "Maybe now's not the time," she continued, her voice dipping even lower, as if the words might sting more if said too loudly. "Was Daniel ever, I don't know, strange with you? I mean, not just typical sibling stuff, but more like controlling, I guess." And just like that, the pot on the stove might as well have disappeared, the entire room flattening into silence as her words echoed in my chest in a way that felt both new and familiar. Like she'd reached into a box I'd kept taped shut for years and casually pulled out something I wasn't ready to see. Because, of course, the answer was yes. Of course, Daniel had always been controlling, not in the obvious ways, not with threats or tantrums or fists, but in the quieter, more insidious ways that are harder to name and even harder to prove. He didn't tell you what to do. He made you feel like you owed him your silence, your agreement, your support. He didn't demand attention. He absorbed it like a black hole, leaving nothing for anyone else, and somehow made you feel guilty for noticing. And worst of all, he had this uncanny ability to twist every situation so that he always came out as either the hero or the victim, never the villain, no matter how much damage he left behind. I could have told Erica that. I could have shared story after story, like the time he forged my signature on a school document and then convinced my mother that I had made the mistake, or the way he used to joke about how I was lucky to be the smart one since I didn't have the looks to get by on charm, or how he once borrowed $1,000 from me during college and never paid it back, but still expected me to thank him for always being there. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I hesitated. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the moment felt so fragile that anything too honest might shatter it, and I said, he's always been intense. You know how he is. A little stubborn, a little bossy. But he means well. It was a lie so well practiced it came out smooth, and as soon as I said it, I hated myself. Because I could hear the disappointment in her silence. Not in me, exactly, but in the world she thought she might be waking up to. I think she'd hoped I'd confirm something she was starting to suspect, to help her make sense of whatever pieces she'd found on her own, but instead I handed her the same polished story everyone else had. The one that kept Daniel comfortably at the center of everything. That was the whisper. That was the moment that should have set everything off, but didn't, not right away. So when Erica stood up at the party, her voice trembling just slightly, and said, I saw the receipts. I saw the messages. I saw everything. I knew exactly what she meant, even though she didn't look at me. I knew she'd gone looking after that phone call, knew she'd pushed past her own doubt and found what I hadn't been brave enough to hand her. And even then, even in that moment, I could feel the pull of my old instincts rising like a tide. Stay quiet. Don't react. Keep the peace. But then my mother turned to me, her face unreadable except for the sharpness in her eyes, and she said, not with anger, not even with fear, but with bitter certainty, you told her. I should have denied it. I should have said, no, I didn't, because that would have been the truth, or at least close enough to it. But I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, and for once, I let the accusation hang in the air without rushing to clear it. Because the truth was, it didn't matter whether I'd told Erica or not. What mattered was that my mother believed I had. And if she believed that, then maybe, for the first time, she was starting to see who Daniel really was, not because she wanted to, not because she was ready, but because the illusion she'd spent her whole life defending was finally starting to crack, and even she couldn't glue it back together fast enough. Across the room, Daniel stood frozen, mouth slightly open, eyes darting toward Erica as if trying to decide whether to laugh it off or explode. He looked small. Not physically, he still had that confident posture, the tailored blazer, the expensive watch, but small, like a child caught in a lie that had gotten too big to cover. And for a moment, I felt something almost like pity. But then I remembered every time I'd been told to shrink so he could grow, every time my accomplishments were ignored so his mediocrity could be praised, every time my voice was dismissed so his ego could be stroked, and the pity melted away, replaced by something colder and far more satisfying. And as my mother turned away from me and leaned toward Erica, her expression suddenly softer, almost pleading, I saw something else in her eyes, something I wasn't expecting, fear. Not fear of what Erica had found, but fear of what else might come out now that the dam had finally cracked. She was no longer trying to protect Daniel, she was trying to protect herself. Because deep down, she knew, whatever came next wasn't just going to blow up his reputation. It was going to rewrite the entire family story. And this time, I wasn't going to stop it. For most of my life, Daniel existed in a kind of untouchable light, not just the spotlight of family attention or parental pride, but something more suffocatingly sacred, like he'd been chosen, not born, to carry the hopes and dreams of an entire lineage that pretended it came from tradition, but was really built on favoritism, denial, and the carefully curated illusion of perfection. He wasn't just a son or a brother, he was a symbol. He was the proof my mother needed that she hadn't failed, that all her sacrifices, her hovering, her relentless comparison of me to him had been worth something. And it wasn't until I stood in that dining room, under the heavy glare of chandelier light and surrounded by people who had all been trained to smile politely no matter what disaster was unfolding in front of them, that I finally understood what kind of machine I had been a part of, a machine designed to protect one person's image at the cost of everyone else's reality. Daniel was standing at the head of the table, his mouth half open, his expression flickering between smugness and panic, like he hadn't decided yet whether to charm his way out of this or pretend to be the one betrayed. He had one hand on the back of Erica's chair, and I could see the subtle clench in his knuckles, the way his jaw tightened when she shifted just out of his reach, as if some part of him still believed that he could control the moment with a single touch. That if he just played the right card, everyone would fall back into line like they always had. But this time was different. Erica didn't sit down. She didn't soften. She didn't do what women in our family had been trained to do, to protect the peace, to lower their voice, to make excuses for a man who didn't deserve them. Instead, she held up her phone, turned the screen toward the room, and said in a voice that was quiet but clear, "I found these 2 nights ago." I wasn't looking, but once I saw one message, I couldn't stop. And the more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just one mistake. This was a pattern. No one said a word. Not a breath. Not a cough. Even the background music that had been playing from some overpriced wireless speaker had stopped, as if the universe itself had paused to see what would happen next. Daniel tried to laugh, a sharp, dismissive little sound that didn't land, and said something like, "You seriously brought this up now? In front of everyone? Don't you think this is a little dramatic?" But Erica didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She simply turned the screen toward my mother, who squinted at it as if it were written in another language, then looked back at me like I had personally programmed the entire thing. And that was when I stood up. Not out of impulse, not out of anger, but because I felt something rising in my chest that I had spent years swallowing, years silencing, years convincing myself was just bitterness or resentment or envy, when really it was the truth. And the truth, when it's been buried long enough, doesn't come out as a whisper. It comes out like a wave. I said his name, not loud, but firm, and I watched as his eyes flicked to me like I was a gnat buzzing at the edge of the frame. And I said, "You always counted on people being too polite to tell the truth. You counted on me staying quiet. On Mom covering for you. On Erica not asking questions. And for a long time, you were right. But not anymore." He rolled his eyes, tried to play it off, mumbled something about old wounds and high school drama like he thought he could minimize the moment, but I didn't stop. I reminded everyone of the time he stole from my college fund because his investment had tanked and he didn't want to stress out our parents, and how, when I found out, Mom told me it was just a family loan and that I should be proud to help my brother. I brought up the time he crashed my car while drunk, then convinced our mother to lie to the insurance company and frame it as a hit and run so he wouldn't lose his license before graduation. I spoke, slowly and carefully, about how he once got caught plagiarizing a major paper in college, and my mother called the dean herself, threatening legal action if they humiliated a bright young man over a misunderstanding, and how the dean, intimidated and exhausted, let it go. I watched the color drain from his face with each example, and I saw how the people in the room, cousins, aunts, friends of the family who'd only ever heard glowing praise, started to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, some of them looking at Daniel with unease. Others at my mother, whose jaw was clenched so tightly I thought she might crack a tooth. And when I finished, when the room had descended into a silence even thicker than before, I said, not loudly, but with a weight that made the words settle like dust, "I didn't tell Erica anything. But I should have. And I'm not sorry she found out. That was when Daniel lost it, not in a big, cinematic way, but in that quiet fury that comes when someone who's always been believed realizes their story isn't working anymore. He called me bitter. He called me jealous. He said I was making things up to feel important, that I had always had a problem with his success. And maybe, in a way, I had. Not because I wanted what he had, not the fake charm or the empty praise or the hollow victories handed to him by people who never asked questions, but because I wanted a world where being decent mattered more than being impressive. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I turned to my mother, whose face had settled into a mask I'd only seen a few times in my life, once at my grandmother's funeral, once when she thought Daniel might lose a scholarship, and once when I told her I was moving out without telling anyone where. She looked at me like a stranger. And then she said, not to me, not to Daniel, not even to Erica, but to the room, this family has always supported each other. We don't air dirty laundry. We handle things with dignity. To which I finally, after years of swallowing it, said, no. We bury things so no one has to look at what's actually rotting underneath. Daniel stormed out after that, not a word to Erica, not a goodbye to the guests. He grabbed his keys and disappeared into the night like a man running from a fire he'd started with his own hands. Erica followed a few minutes later, after apologizing to everyone for the scene, even though she was the only one who had dared to speak honestly. And the rest of the guests? They lingered for a while, quietly finishing their drinks, mumbling about early mornings and long drives, leaving behind half-eaten cake and untouched champagne and an atmosphere so thick with discomfort that no amount of candlelight could disguise it. My mother didn't say another word to me as she collected the empty glasses and blew out the candles one by one, her movements sharp and robotic, like she was putting away more than just party decorations. And when I turned to leave, she finally looked at me and said, with no emotion at all, "You've ruined this family." I didn't respond. Because I knew the truth. I hadn't ruined anything. I had just stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. A week had passed since that evening, a week that felt less like time moving forward and more like an extended exhale, the kind of breath you don't even realize you've been holding for decades until it escapes all at once, leaving behind an aching emptiness that no one warns you about when they talk about speaking the truth. In theory, telling the truth is supposed to come with clarity, with a sense of moral satisfaction, with fresh air and weight lifted, but in practice, it leaves behind rubble, and sometimes you find yourself standing alone in the middle of the ruin you helped uncover, unsure if the destruction was a necessary cleansing or just another kind of punishment. In the days that followed Daniel's engagement party, or what was supposed to be a celebration, and instead ended up as a public unraveling, no one called me. Not Daniel, who had apparently disappeared into some rented beach house under the guise of needing space, not Erica, who I imagined was somewhere caught between devastation and furious clarity, and certainly not my mother, who, by all accounts, had taken to her bed like a Victorian widow mourning the death of her perfectly constructed fantasy. The silence wasn't just absence, it was accusation. It was the kind of orchestrated silence that a family deploys like a weapon, not a consequence of wrongdoing, but a declaration that you are now the problem, that you are the threat, and that until you apologize, repent, and, most importantly, retract, the doors will remain closed. But I didn't want back in. I didn't miss the dinners where I was barely asked about my life. I didn't long for the polite conversations filled with nothing but well-rehearsed praise for Daniel's latest professional victories, or my mother's endless rewrites of family history where my contributions were edited out like bloopers. What I found myself missing, and this surprised me, was the comfort of knowing exactly what role I played. Because even though that role had been humiliating, even though it had choked me slowly over the years like a too-tight collar, at least it was familiar. At least it made the silences make sense. Now, there was nothing to hide behind. I spent most of that week doing small things that felt meaningless, but grounded: laundry, organizing the spice rack, cleaning behind the refrigerator, the kind of mundane rituals you turn to when you're not sure if you've just burned a bridge or lit a path forward. I kept thinking about Erica, wondering if she was somewhere staring at the same text messages I once held in my hands, asking herself how long she'd been lying to herself, or worse, how long others had been lying to her. I wondered if she hated me for not saying more when she called. I wondered if she admired me for finally saying what I did. Maybe both. And then, late on a rainy Thursday afternoon, just as the sky cracked open with that low, almost lazy kind of thunder that doesn't really threaten anything but fills the air with a strange electricity, my phone buzzed. One message. From her. Just 3 words. Thank you. Truly. There was no punctuation. No follow-up. No explanation. But the weight of those 3 words landed so heavily on me I had to sit down, my knees giving way slightly as if my body understood something my brain hadn't yet caught up to, that even in the chaos, even in the ambiguity of it all, something had shifted. A cord had been cut. A truth had landed. And even if it didn't fix anything, even if it didn't heal what Daniel had broken, it had opened a door. And sometimes, that's the best you can ask for. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't want to, but because some messages don't need a response, they just need to be received. That evening, I drove out to my grandmother's old house, the one that had sat empty since her funeral 3 years ago, now slowly surrendering to time with its peeling paint and overgrown hedges and sagging porch steps. I hadn't been back since we sold it, but something in me needed to sit where she used to sit, to breathe the air she once called home. To remember that there had once been someone in the family who saw me not as Daniel's sister or Marjorie's daughter, but simply as Carla, flawed, quiet, observant Carla, who didn't shine but who saw everything and who wasn't ashamed of that. I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and watched the rain streak down the windows, the kind of slow, rhythmic rain that doesn't demand shelter but invites reflection. I thought about what Grandma used to say when she was being particularly sharp. Sometimes silence is loyalty, and sometimes it's just cowardice wearing a church dress. She'd say it when someone bit their tongue instead of standing up, when someone avoided conflict under the guise of dignity, when someone, like me, watched injustice unfold and convinced themselves it was better not to rock the boat. And for years, I had clung to silence like it was some sort of moral high ground, like staying quiet made me noble, when really, it just made things easier for everyone else. Not anymore. I wasn't noble. I wasn't brave. But I had finally stopped holding the hose while they played with matches. And if that made me the villain in their version of events, then so be it, because at least I wasn't pretending anymore. As the sky darkened and the rain tapered off into a gentle drizzle, I felt something settle inside me, not peace, not closure, but a kind of grounded stillness that comes when you finally understand that you may never be forgiven, never be understood, never be welcomed back, but you are no longer pretending to be someone you're not. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was from my mother. No call, no voice, just a single, sharp message. I hope you're happy. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring slightly as the screen lit up my face in the fading light. And I smiled. Not because I was happy. I wasn't. Not really. But because for the first time in my life, she was looking at me, not through the lens of what I wasn't, not through the shadow of my brother, but directly, sharply, unmistakably at me. And whether it was blame or fear or hatred or some twisted form of respect, it didn't matter. Because I was finally seen.